Hello, John.
Hey, George.
How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. And you?
Good, good. It's been a little while.
Yeah, summer's over. I'm teaching again.
Back to the 9 to 5.
Or, 10 to 11.
Whatever. Yeah, well, I haven't been doing much different at all. I've just been working every day on the book and got a couple little expeditions in.
Yeah, well, before I'm really eager to talk about your some of the things that you're finding out about cancer. I read a piece that came out last month that I thought was an amazing piece of science writing. But I guess we should talk a little bit about the big anniversary coming up, the 10th anniversary of 9/11.
Yeah, when this is showing, unless they start it, a few hours before in the wee hours of the morning, like before midnight, it's going to be the day before 9/11/01.
Right.
God, can you believe a decade has passed?
Yeah, and it still seems pretty fresh.
Oh, yeah.
Do you want to exchange reminiscences? Is that something?
Oh, yeah, everybody does this, but, I don't think I can resist, so, and I think we've probably mentioned these before, so we can just kind of do it briefly, but, everyone has that flashbulb memory, burned in their brain, just like, the famous example of where were you when John F. Kennedy was shot, or for our parents, where were you when the announcement of Pearl Harbor came, and, for our generation, at least so far, and for a couple of other generations, it's 9/11.
Yeah.
What were you up to that day?
Well, so I was in Garrison, which is about 30 miles north of New York City as the crow flies, and I was up working in my home office on the second floor, and lost in my own little world, and Susie, my wife, now ex-wife, called out to me from another room. She'd been listening to a rock station. It had interrupted its program, and to announce that a plane had just flown into the World Trade Center. And so Susie was really alarmed, and I ran downstairs. We turned on the TV, and there was a live shot of the World Trade Center with all this smoke billowing out of one of the towers. And as we were watching, stunned, in real time, the second plane flew into the second tower.
Right.
And what we did after that was we remembered that there's a hill right near our house from which, on a clear day, and that was a very clear day, of course, you can see the Manhattan skyline. So we ran up to the top of this hill, and by the time we got there, both of the towers had fallen. All we could see was smoke. We could see no sign of the towers themselves.
So you see that hole in the familiar skyline. And
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how about you? You were in Santa Fe.
It was remarkably similar, except for being able to, get up high and see what happened. I was working upstairs on the second floor in my home office, absorbed in, I don't remember what. That was about the time I would have been writing my book on quantum computing, actually, A Shortcut Through Time. And all morning since I got to my desk, I've been trying to call up the New York Times website, just as I habitually do, to see what's going on in the world, and it kept not loading. Mm-hmm. And I thought, wonder why that is. And at some point during this, my wife Nancy, who's now my ex-wife, sadly, comes upstairs and tells me what happened. I mean, she worked at home too in a downstairs office, and she had the kind of job where she was like in constant contact, either through her computer or on the telephone with her office back in New York, or New Jersey, actually, very near there, and where you are, I mean. And then, I turned on a little TV that I had in my office, and, there it was, so.
Yeah, it was It was pretty shocking. It turned out that I didn't know anybody well who died in the attack, but the reverberations were pretty severe around here. And on that, it was a crazy day. They ended up letting our kids out of school, and Susie and I had a closing on a second mortgage for our home that day, and so we had to go to a bank, and our daughter Sky got really sick, and then there were all these reports floating around that terrorists were attacking Indian Point, the nuclear power facility.
Right.
So everybody was just scared to death and confused.
Well,
Didn't know what was happening. I remember thinking about what this meant for my children, and I've actually written about this since then. And because I had, in the 90s, in spite of some of the problems in, Bill Clinton had with Somalia, the Black Hawk Down incident, and the fighting in the former Yugoslavia and so forth, the 90s were a very peaceful time for the United States and for the world generally. There was especially for the first world. And I had begun to get very hopeful about the future being very peaceful for my children, and they wouldn't have to grow up with the sword, especially of total nuclear annihilation, hanging over them. And I remember on 9/11 really thinking, oh my God, does this mean we're looking forward to this period of chaos and terror and attacks coming out of the sky, and what does this mean for my children? And I'm still thinking about that, actually.
Well, for me, after just the immediate horror, begin to, slightly fade, and you're just trying to, adapt to this, this what seemed like this horrible new reality. I had this real feeling of hope that this was going to be such a shock to the system, at least in the United States, that it was going to really be like the equivalent of a physical phase change, like when water turns to steam or water turns to ice, that either way, that there was going to be this like really profound realignment in the way that people looked at in the world, and the most salient arena being politics, and it would be this Democrat and Republican, and this petty political squabbling would go away, and people would say, wow, we're really all on the same side here. And that, they closed the stock market for I can't remember how many days, and people were talking about, hey, when it opens, let's just all go out there and buy stock, any stock, even if you just have a little money, buy a few shares, and we're going to show the world that this, didn't affect us in that way. And then, of course, the morning comes when they open the stock market and the big plunge begins. And then after that, it was just so quickly how we, just locked into the same old thing. I think it was the very same time that show 24, that season had debuted. And I hadn't seen it before, but I remember making a point of watching one of them, and there's something about a terrorist, jumping out of an airplane, some beautiful female terrorist jumping out of an airplane after she sets off a bomb, and I'm thinking, well, yeah, but that was, of course, recorded before all this. And then I'm thinking, well, yeah, but they didn't have to play it. And there were actually Hollywood people talking about, they weren't going to have violence and terrorism anymore, and not that they should be banned from that, but they just didn't feel like anything they wanted to do anymore. It just seemed like trivializing something so horrible. And there was this talk about the end of irony, right. And and then before you know it, the stock market crashes immediately. Republicans and Democrats are arguing about whether the new airport security should be privatized and farmed out to corporations, which it had been and been pretty bad, or, if it should be run by the government. And, just the same old thing, everything aligns back to normal, and it just turns out to be, in many ways, the slight perturbation that we absorb so easily. And there was just something very depressing about that. I actually wrote an essay on that I'll link to. Yeah,
I guess I had somewhat of the same reaction, except that in some ways, it wasn't just back to business as normal. It certainly wasn't business as normal in terms of what we had in the 1990s. It was, we invaded Afghanistan, and so our we decided to go after this terrorist group that apparently was based in Afghanistan by invading and basically overturning, conquering the country, destroying the Taliban, wresting the control of the country from them, occupying the country. And then, of course, we did the same in Iraq. Even though
that's really the same old script, though, right?
Pardon me?
But that's really kind of the same old script. It shows that there wasn't a profound change. I mean, not that I'm saying that we should, lie down the lion, the lamb with the lion. I mean, whichever is which. But it was the same kind of script of how you react to something like that. And
that's true.
Pretty soon it's just the old. But no, I know what you mean. I mean, of course, I thought those were both great ideas at the time.
So now we've been in war with Afghanistan for a decade, and it's been longer than the war in Vietnam, the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, there are various calculations of how much they cost, but they seem to be in the trillions. I actually just wrote a piece in Scientific American about our response to the 9/11 attacks and to the threat of terrorism in general. I leaned heavily on an analysis by a political scientist named John Mueller, who's actually been on Blogging Heads before. And he, together with an engineer who's also a risk assessment expert, have done a series of papers and also now a new book on counterterrorism programs in terms of risk-benefit analysis. And they've concluded that the benefits of these programs don't even come close to justifying the enormous costs.
Yeah.
So just a couple of statistics. This is from a paper that they wrote for Foreign Affairs, and I repeat some of these statistics in my latest column in Scientific American. They say that the overall risk from terrorism over the last few decades for Americans is about one. Your chances of dying in a terrorist attack are 1 in 3.5 million per year. So that includes 9/11.
Presumably.
Yeah, it includes 9/11. That
includes 9/11, which skewed it a lot higher than it was.
Right.
If you took another sample of 10 years.
But it also would include, for example, the attack of Timothy McVeigh in the 1990s on a government facility. I'm assuming it would include things like the Unabomber attacks. And just to put this in context, so that's a chance of 1 in every 3.5 million. Your chances of drowning in a bathtub, your annual chances of drowning in a bathtub, are 1 in 950,000. So more than 3 times as likely as dying in a terrorist attack. Your chances of being killed in an accident involving a home appliance is about 1 in every 500,000.
Yeah.
And so I realized that terrorism, it reminds me of the discussion that we had about nuclear power, and nuclear accidents evoke this special fear in us, and as a result, actually, nuclear energy facilities are incredibly safe, with the exception so far of, obviously the Fukushima accident was this kind of freak accident, but as far as fatalities go, those are still very small. But if you just strip away the emotional dimension of terrorism and you stack it up against other risks, cancer, for example, your annual chances of dying of cancer are 1 in 540. It's just exponentially greater than terrorism. Your chances of dying in an automobile accident are about 1 in 8,000. And we're spending, according to Mueller and Stewart, about $100 billion a year extra compared to pre-9/11 spending on counterterrorism measures in the United States to reduce, this is the question, how much are we reducing terrorism fatalities? But we're reducing already a minuscule amount, trying to reduce it even further.
Yeah, but I don't know. To me, that just misses like the most important point, which the definition or the essence of terrorism is that you're terrorizing an entire population by killing a very, very few people.
Right.
So you're really putting in, minimum resources as a terrorist, and then maximizing the results and creating the sense of terror, the psychological state where, suddenly, it's like, you Americans just felt so smug and safe in your homes. You're not safe in your homes anymore. And even though the economy did amazingly well in absorbing the elimination of one of the great financial centers of the world, the Twin Towers, it was just as conceivable for years that they were just going to say, well, let's wait a year or two now and let them, start getting a little comfortable, and then wipe out, the House of Congress, or this time do it right with the Pentagon, and just creating this constant uncertainty, and then so you can't really just quantify it in dollars spent per lives saved. It's dollars spent to try to restore as best you can this sense of well-being or comfort, even though it's never going to be the same. And then of course, part of the problem is that the very reaction of reacting to terrorism feeds into that uncertainty too. Right. Every time you go on an airplane, you're reminded, of what could happen. But I don't know. That just seems their analysis seemed too simplistic to me. But it's good to have those numbers because
I agree, George. I think so they don't even include, and I thought this was fairly conservative of them. They don't even include the costs of the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. They don't include the fact, for example, that 6,000 and counting American soldiers and some civilians who are working in Afghanistan and Iraq have been killed, which is more than twice as many as the number of people who were killed on 9/11, of course. They don't include the fact that our actions abroad, our illegal detentions of people, the use of torture and so forth have, according to a lot of analysts, inflamed more of this anti-American feeling and created more potential terrorists. So I understand the emotional dimension of this, but at some point it's the responsibility of our leaders to get past the emotions and not to pander to the emotions, the very understandable emotions of ordinary people to an event like 9/11, and to try to come up with a rational policy that actually does make us safer and doesn't waste our valuable resources, because it's not as though we have an infinite amount of money to spend on these sorts of things.
No, but of course it wasn't just pandering. I mean, certainly not for many, many years. It seemed perfectly, possible that this, could happen again, and was just going to, just something so unthinkable coming out of the blue like that.
Yes.
It's just, but yeah, and obviously, I'm not saying that, what we did, has been this wonderful success, and that we necessarily even should have done it in the way we did, but yeah, it's just, it just seems to me like an insoluble problem.
You know what? It reminds me a little bit of the debate over health care in this country, where there were people who were defending the American health care system, which is roughly twice as expensive as any other system in the world, and it is not delivering a good product. Americans are way down on measures of overall health compared to other countries around the world, but we're way above everybody else in terms of per capita spending. And yet, if you try to have a rational discussion about how we spend our dollars, you get people talking about, well, when are you going to pull the plug on grandma, and I'm going to spend every goddamn cent I can on trying to save my relative with terminal cancer and these sorts of things, and it becomes impossible to have a rational discussion. And yet we have to have a rational discussion.
And how do you do that?
I mean, I don't envy the people in charge for having to deal with issues like this, where you're dealing with life and death, and to a certain extent you're making guesses on the future, and you have to do some triage and set priorities in a way that can force you to make some excruciating choices. But that's what their job is, for Christ's sake.
And it's just so agonizing to think what might have been, if there could have, if someone had perfect omniscience and could see, what the next 10 years from 2001 would be like, and, and apportioning resources differently, whatever. There's this piece that David Sanger wrote that's going to be in the Times tomorrow. It's up on the website since yesterday, and part of a package called The Reckoning, just several really great articles on, 10 years and, let's reckon what happened and where we are. And it's called The Price of Lost Chances, and considering these very things. What if that money had gone into education? What if it had gone into, fighting, just various diseases and conditions, including cancer, improving the cities, more public works, to give people, better lives, and then it just reminded me of the euphoria that surrounded the fall of the Berlin Wall and the amazingly quick dissolution of the Soviet Empire.
Right.
And it seemed like, again, there's going to be this huge change, and suddenly all this money we were pouring into this ridiculous Cold War and mutual assured destruction with nuclear weapons. We're going to stop this, and all this money is going to be there, to go into schools and all these things, so desperately needed. And of course, it doesn't happen.
It's
something else comes along. The money's absorbed into that, and
in terms of just not looking just at counterterrorism, but defense spending in general. I know I've mentioned this before, but I'm going to mention it again, because to me it is such a absolutely crucial fact for understanding spending in our country at a time when we're in economic distress. The United States spends almost as much as the rest of the world combined in defense. Our defense spending has more than doubled since 9/11. Our next closest competitor in defense spending is China, and we spend about 5 or 6 times more per year on defense than China, which of course has a much larger population than we do. So again, it seems to me, but we cannot have a rational discussion about defense spending in this country yet. People talk about reducing defense spending, and usually they just mean holding it level or just tweaking it at the margins, tiny little reductions. And it just makes absolutely no sense.
Well, and then too, you have all these, these lock-in effects. Once you have a military and you have a defense, and then you have a defense industry, and you privatize the, the production of all these jets and guidance devices and missiles and all of these expensive things. This goes to corporate America, and then then this huge lobby just to produce this stuff in order to produce it, and I mean, you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to think that this is a huge problem. I mean, even good old Dwight Eisenhower, wasn't he that coined the term military-industrial complex?
That's right. On the other hand, just so people don't get too gloomy, there are a number of scholars. I've been trying to do it in my own amateurish way, but there are a number of very prominent, excellent, rigorous scholars who have been pointing out that we are in a period in which overall casualties from international war, from civil war, even insurgencies and sort of quasi-wars of various forms of organized violence are really declining. And in some ways, we're in one of the most peaceful periods in history. There's a wonderful essay in, let's see, it's Foreign Policy. I'll link to this by
I'd like to read
a political scientist named Joshua Goldstein, who is talking about the decline and possible end of war. This is something I talk about in a book that I've been working on for a long time that's coming out later this fall. It's a major theme of a new book by Steven Pinker called The Angels, just looking for it here, The Angels of Our Better Nature. I think that's what the title is. John Mueller, who also put together these counterterrorism statistics that I mentioned earlier, he's been writing about the decline of war for a long time. So in spite of the United States spending, maintaining this gigantic military, and being in this state of kind of, I think, almost pathological hypervigilance against threats, there are a lot of positive trends in the world right now away from war.
Well, good.
Yeah, good.
I mean, no, good, really. I mean, I can't wait to read your book, and I'd like to read this article as well. I mean, it's just so counterintuitive, I think, for almost everyone that's the case, that, you know, violence really is less than it was, you know, for many centuries. And,
right.
Yeah, wow.
So anyway...
Oh, I could provide a segue, I just realized.
Oh, good.
War on cancer.
Yes.
You know, there again, you know, there's that metaphor. Nixon, you know, it was during his watch, the early 70s, when they started the war on cancer, and you know, to try to defeat this enemy, which of course has not happened at all. And I was really glad you drew my attention to this op-ed piece, which I had missed, in the New York Times. It's called "The Annals of Extreme Surgery." You know, kind of a little spin-off on a typical New Yorker article kind of title, or a subtitle. And it's by this guy, Baron Lerner, who is a professor of medicine and public health at Columbia University. And you know, he's writing about, which I hadn't heard of until I read this, a new form of chemotherapy for people who have colon cancer and is it also, let's see.
I think cancer of the stomach.
Stomach and, it's gastrointestinal cancer, let's say. And you know, chemotherapy is normally administered intravenously, and it's a systemic poison that basically works when it works by killing everything inside, except that cancer cells, just by definition, are rapidly multiplying far more rapidly than the surrounding cells because of all these genetic mutations, and therefore it should kill them to a greater extent than it kills your tissues that are behaving themselves, except, you know, there's horrible exceptions like other cells that multiply very quickly, like skin cells, you know, including the epithelial cells, you know, lining your intestinal tract are constantly being replaced, and many other cells. But so now they've come up with heated chemotherapy. So if someone has a gastrointestinal cancer, you've removed all of the cancer you can, and then basically you flush the gastrointestinal tract with this heated chemo, you know, which reacts, you know, more vigorously with the cells and maybe gets that last little renegade cell in there. And you know, it sounds on paper, I guess, like something that might work, but he's, you know, really pointing out that there's no good evidence that this is improving survival odds, and that it may actually be be worse than, a normal systemic cure, and then with collateral damage and again all the war metaphors. But wow.
Yeah, it strikes me as being so. It's kind of gruesome. I found myself
it's also brutal,
wincing when I was reading about it, and then in the same piece he compares it to some of the treatments for breast cancer in the past. Radical mastectomies, or what were actually termed super radical mastectomies.
Yeah, far more radical than now.
Yeah, which you're.
Well, yeah, I was glad he. That guy that he mentioned, Johns Hopkins surgeon named William Halsted.
Mm-hmm.
He was really famous for that, and that new book, Emperor of All Maladies.
Yes.
By this guy Mukherjee. He has a whole section on this guy Halsted and just the extent to which he really pioneered this aggressive cancer surgery. And the reason I was compelled to interrupt you, it just occurred to me that there comes the war metaphor again, because in this column, the writer notes that all these surgeons were coming back from World War II, and then they had this kind of gung-ho attitude about what they'd done on the battlefield and defeat the enemy. The enemy's the cancer cells, and get in there with your knives. So you were going to describe what some of this surgery entailed.
Well, the super radical mastectomy involves removing, in some cases, the shoulders of a woman. If the cancer is in the legs, part of the pelvis is removed along with the leg. It's called a hindquarter amputation. It's just, and what I found fascinating about it is the analogy to kind of a military ruthlessness, and there's this philosophy that is being brought to bear here that more is better. In fact, this writer Lerner uses that phrase, more is better, and the idea is that first of all, there's a bias toward doing something, even if you're not sure if what you're doing is going to improve the health of the patient and rid her or him of the disease.
Yeah.
And without,
they think that'll happen. It's not like they're, they think and hope that'll happen, and yet their perception is skewed perhaps by.
Yeah, I guess I can see the frustration of a physician faced with somebody with one of these awful diseases, and they don't want to just stand by and watch the disease progress, but as a result, they try out these extremely aggressive therapies that often make people sicker. I hate to bring this up, George, because I really have been hammered about this in the past, but it really reminds me of how mental illness is treated. And there are lots of studies that show that people fared better in the pre-drug era.
Yeah. There are no studies showing that people with a metastatic cancer fared better without chemo than with chemo. Right. So that's really kind of a different thing. We did talk about this the iatrogenesis of various kinds of treatments, but with cancer, if you compare, no matter how sickening chemotherapy and the following, usually, well, not necessarily following, sometimes accompanying radiation therapy,
right.
Just a horrible assault on the body, and yet, it works in many cases, most cases, I think, strikingly.
Geez, George,
well.
You tell me that the last time I looked at cancer mortality rates, they were after rising for a period beginning in the early 70s, ironically, when Nixon declared a war on cancer and started putting some serious cash into the National Cancer Institute. There was a rise for the next couple of decades until the early 90s. There's been a slight decline since then, but overall, mortality rates have not changed.
No. Yeah, I'm not saying that chemo radiation is this wonderful miracle cure by any means, but I guess the point I really wanted to make was that compared to the stuff described in this column in the old Halstead methods, this is a huge advance. And the reason they were doing these super radical mastectomies, this was really before the advent of chemotherapy. So chemotherapy was definitely an improvement over that, for all of its horrors. And you're right that, cancer death rates and incidence rates, have pretty much just leveled off, just a slight decline since the 1990s. This is when you adjust for the aging of the population,
right?
Which you have to do, and for the increase in the size of the population. But still, someone, like with metastatic breast cancer or uterine cancer, caught stage 3 or stage 4, and they undergo what's now become the traditional chemotherapy regimens, usually with these platinum-based chemo, and then either sandwiched in between sessions or before or afterwards, the radiation. It depends on the nature and the etiology of the cancer. But, this really does arrest a lot of cancers, if not forever, for many years or even decades.
Yeah.
And,
well, listen, George,
so, they really do work, but, it's just so far from what you would hope would have come to pass by now, which was kind of one of the reasons I went to this big cancer science meeting in Orlando this spring and got around to writing about it last month for the New York Times, just trying to see what the cutting edge was, not in therapy so much, because I know that, there's all kinds of new therapies in the pipeline, in the laboratories and in clinical trials involving like monoclonal antibodies, where that a certain cancer cell in this particular patient is overexpressing or overproducing a certain type of receptors, little molecules on the surface of the cell. So you target cells that have those receptors selectively and deliver the poisons only to them. And a few of these things are in use, but it's still a minority of what goes on, and it's usually accompanied by the same, much more brutal systemic poisoning kind of chemotherapy. But anyway, so I went to this meeting just wanting to kind of see what our cutting edge knowledge was as far as understanding what cancer is and how it arises.
George?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, well, yeah. Tell me more.
I just
let me just say, okay. I want you to summarize what's in this article, but I thought this article was fascinating. I already was flattering you before. I'll flatter you again. I thought this was a model of great science writing. Obviously, the whole theme of this is the complexification of our understanding of cancer, and so that is a topic that you can easily get lost in. You're really getting down into some nitty-gritty details of how cancer works, and especially the genetics of cancer, and so all the things that happen in a cell that can lead to cancer. But you sort of set up the previous broad understanding of how cancer works, and then systematically undermined that and showed how so much of that earlier, somewhat simple model has been called into question and basically just complicated by all these details.
More complicated than anything. It's more like, the metaphor that struck me one day when I was sitting in these sessions was, it just reminded me of cosmology with the Big Bang Theory. And the Big Bang Theory is still, it's very much intact, but it's become elaborated by all of these little curlicues of detail, like the inflationary epoch, for example, and many other little epicycular things. And with cancer therapy, the Big Bang Theory would be the closest thing you could really say was it's called the monoclonal cell theory, and basically it's this idea that you have a single cell. For some reason or another, it gets a mutation. This can be because of an external force. It could be carcinogen, anything from benzene to oxygen radicals in the body. Something causes a break in the DNA or a mutation that knocks out a gene that's involved in regulating the rate at which the cell divides. So it starts rapidly dividing, or more rapidly than its neighbors. And once it does that, it's more likely than its neighbors to accumulate mutation number 2, which might be to something that they call a tumor suppressor gene, which, whose function actually is just to rein in cellular division if it seems to be going too quickly, kind of a homeostatic flywheel on that. So that gets knocked out, and then the cell's going even faster. And then usually when this happens, the cell has this way of kind of sensing that things are screwed up, and it initiates apoptosis. In other words, the cell kills itself, for the good of the common weal, and so the gene that triggers apoptosis gets knocked out, and then you're really starting to get a tumor, and more mutations will give the cell the ability to secrete like proteases and enzymes, so it can start digging into the surrounding flesh, and another mutation will turn on angiogenesis, this program where it starts making blood vessels and grows them into the blood supply. So it's starting to become like this this kind of quasi-sicko renegade organ growing in your body.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's the Big Bang Theory, and it's still very much considered to be true. And the people who codified this were Robert Weinberg at MIT and Hanahan, who I think is now in Switzerland. But it occurred to me that with all these new theories and ideas and elaborations, it was like the Big Bang, and it's still intact, and yet it's like it's more like when dark matter and dark energy came in. Mm-hmm. So like suddenly like 99% of the universe is dark energy and dark matter. And so it's like figure and ground reversal, so suddenly all this stuff you thought wasn't part of the problem, turns out to leap to the forefront.
So this is an ongoing theme in genetics, that what was recently known as junk DNA that really had no function in the body, that's just sort of along for the ride, turns out to be doing all sorts of things that are functionally significant, although I guess in the case of cancer, they're not promoting positive functions. They're sort of a wrench in the works.
That's a perfect example. So like 2%, 98% of the DNA was said to be junk DNA, and over quite a few years that idea has really been fading as they find that a lot of the junk DNA is doing stuff. But that to me was like finding out that the universe is 90% dark matter, or dark matter and dark energy. Just this flip of foreground and background. And as you suggest, that's there was this really great talk by this guy Pandolfi at Harvard Medical School, who was talking about this new idea where genes in your canonical genome, the 2%, are actually talking to genes in the dark matter DNA, the junk DNA. They're exchanging signals and kind of, and that when this happens, this is part of the process that might tip a cell toward malignancy.
Yeah, this reminded me of Carl Zimmer has been writing about this trend and among others, has been writing about this trend in genetics, where you once had, beyond cancer, you have the broad understanding of how genes work in the body. And so, between the early 1950s and the mid-1960s, you basically got the cracking of the genetic code, the understanding of how DNA, with the help of RNA, produces the proteins of which we are largely made. And it was this astonishingly simple theory that can really explain all biological things. And then especially over the last, 15 years or so, that theory has just, my understanding is that it's much worse than Big Bang cosmology. The complications are really fundamental and pervasive. And, the basic, the core of the theory, I guess, is still intact. But but it's become hideously complicated. The question I have for you, George, going back to therapies, is Well, one of the implications of the new view of genetics is very complicated, is that genetic therapies might turn out to be much more difficult than we had thought. And these new findings provide an explanation of why gene therapy has been a tremendous disappointment over the last 20 years or so. I mean, really, it hasn't worked at all. It's certainly not compared to the expectations that people had 20 years ago when it was just starting. Do the people looking at cancer from the point of view of really just trying to understand it, are they really talking about what the implications are for treatment? I would think that one implication would be, I mean, you even talk about how a tumor has ordinary healthy cells in it that somehow are enlisted in the the functioning of the tumor, which of course is counter to that of the health of the whole body. So does that mean that somehow, I mean, what are the implications of that for a really kind of blunt force approach like radiation or chemo, where you're just kind of poisoning everything at once?
Yeah, I mean, the original idea was that, people tended to think of a cancerous tumor as being, pretty much of a homogeneous mass of these renegade mutated cells. And, and there are all these subclones because, every time one of these cells would divide, you set off a new branch that's getting its own mutations. And one of these clones within the tumor would, develop different abilities like angiogenesis. And then, then just over the years, they've realized that a lot of the, healthy cells are really recruited to join in. So, an example would be, in a way, you can almost think of a malignant tumor as having a means of fooling the immune system and then getting these cells to flock to the area whose job is normally to heal wounds. And, healing wounds means producing tissue, and producing tissue is what the tumor wants to do, although it's cancerous tissue, so it can, recruit those cells. And there's just numerous examples that I get into in the article. But, so, I mean, maybe there's a possibility of attacking some of these support cells, these so-called stromal cells, that are, really helping the tumor survive. And, I mean, the famous work by Judah Folkman of trying to turn off angiogenesis in the tumor is sort of an example of that. But, looking at it more broadly, all these people that I'm writing about are talking about this very, very basic cellular science, and to what extent are they thinking about translating this into cures?
Right.
And this has become a big criticism of basic cancer research, with some people saying, well, maybe this money that's going into, studying things like non-canonical DNA, for example, in all these new cellular processes, or laboratories spending their whole careers, elucidating one particular molecular circuit in a particular kind of cancerous cell. Would this money better, go into prevention, to more epidemiology, to find external factors? And I don't agree with that. I'm just very much of the feeling that the more money you put into this very basic research may have a very long-term payoff, but you have to understand this stuff to do anything about it. But I actually asked this question to Robert Weinberg, the guy who with Hanahan wrote this famous paper, The Hallmarks of Cancer, which they updated earlier this year, which was kind of the peg to my story. But we were talking about this in his office in Cambridge, and he said, well, to me, cancer is a fascinating intellectual problem, and I just would want more than anything in the world to solve it. So when I'm sitting down doing this work, and lately he's been working on this fascinating thing called the epithelial mesenchymal transition, another one of these examples of off-the-shelf processes that a cancer cell can turn on at the wrong time and use to its own devices. But Weinberg's talking about this, and he says, no, when I'm doing my research in my lab, with my researchers, I'm not really thinking about cures, but, of course I'm hoping, deep down that this will lead to a cure. And And lately, actually, I was in Cambridge because I was going to a mini symposium on what they call translational research. And it's actually this effort to get these basic results from the university laboratories into the clinic as soon as possible. So they're very cognizant of that. But, and then at the same time, many people are working on this real basic stuff. You have other people who are specifically working on therapies and treatment. So my sense is that the system, is fundamentally sound the way they're doing this. They just need more money at every level.
Right. Maybe they can take it from some of those failed or pointless counterterrorism programs. I'm sorry, I had to throw that in. I want to ask you about an idea that was in your piece that I found really fascinating and creepy. You've got this line that says, cancer researchers are also awakening to the fact that some 90% of the protein encoding cells in our body are microbes. Now, by that term, do you mean, this sounds almost like, by the time I was done with your piece, I was thinking that this is taking the selfish gene theory way too far. It's as though we are basically, we're not a unified self. We're this colony of all these conflicted, squabbling little mini cells, which have their own ulterior motives that often run.
And even worse when they're not squabbling and they're. More the idea was, it's natural to think of it as us versus them. And, this is a common number that's thrown around. 90% of the cells in our body are actually microorganisms, mostly in our intestinal tract. But
now, what does that mean, though? What's the difference between a microbe and a cell that would be, considered to be not a microbe or part of the body?
Okay, well, see, we should mention, too, that there's a really good piece on this general thing, the microbiome, they call it. That's the collection of all the genes in your body that reside in these microorganisms that live inside you. But Carl Zimmer did a nice piece on this that we can link to. And I knew about this, but then I was sitting at this one session, and they were talking about something that had never really occurred to me, at least, top conscious level, which is these microbes have genomes. The genomes, just like the genomes in our cells, can produce signaling proteins and send them out so they can signal to other microbes, but they also signal to our own cells, and our own cells signal to these microbes. So there's this constant conversation going on. And so if you take like 99%, so you go from 90 to 99% of the genes in our body that are producing proteins are inside these microbes. And the only consolation is that we outweigh them like I don't know by what ratio, but this just complicates the whole. It complicates cellular biology, and specifically it complicates the whole understanding of cancer, because there's all kinds of indications that, particularly in stomach and esophageal cancer, that the nature of your microbiome, what kind of microbes that you're playing host to, can affect your rate of getting these certain cancers.
There are a couple of things that came to mind as I was reading your piece. One is that there's a trend in neuroscience also towards complexification, although, neuroscience never had its basic paradigm that became complicated. They're still searching for their basic paradigm, but the basic picture. Let's say if you used to have a fairly simple idea of what a cancer cell was. Well, we used to have a fairly simple idea of what a brain cell was and did, and saw it as a kind of simple switch or a transistor or so forth. And now the view is that every single neuron is like an absolutely uniquely constructed computer in its own right, far from being a transistor. And we keep discovering new neurotransmitters and new hormones that change the chemistry of neural transmission and so forth, and the interactions between neurons change. And it also reminded me of this book by Marvin Minsky, this kind of crazy genius of AI, called Societies of Mind, where he described the mind as far from a unified entity as this, as a whole society of all little mini selves that are all sort of jostling for position against each other all the time.
Although he's looking at that more at a software so-called level, that
that's right.
Whatever the details of what the neurons are doing, that what emerges are these little agents, that he refers to, that interact and give rise to yet another level, which is the mind. And well, maybe you know this. One thing that occurred to me, this whole figure ground thing with cancer research and then with cosmology. And I remember when I was writing more about neuroscience, like when I wrote my book, In the Palaces of Memory, about how the brain stores memories, what was happening on the neuronal level. And back then it occurred to me, the old, the drunk looking under the lamppost to find his keys effect. I mean, maybe just because early on we locked into, studying a certain aspect of the brain, but maybe it turns out that, like the brain is basically made of neurons that are believed to do all the information processing, right?
Yes.
And then there's a support network of the glial cells, which are supposed to just basically provide nutrients and take away the garbage. So it's kind of like, the city services. Is there anyone saying that maybe the glial cells are doing the processing and the neurons are just sitting there, or that there's more interaction in information processing?
I vaguely recall that we talked about that very topic several years ago. It was one of the first conversations that we had on Blogging Heads. There was an article, I think it was in Nature, called The Dark Matter of the Brain. And it was, and I think it was about glial cells and all these other cells that had been thought to be, as you say, kind of low-level functionaries or having very little significant signal processing functioning. It wasn't cognitively significant, but now there are new findings that were suggesting that some of these cells actually were vital to functioning. So
I'd forgotten that.
Yeah.
Boy, maybe that little seed was planted in my brain later that came out in the cancer article using that dark matter. Oh, you know what I just found? There's a column by Carl Zimmer, his blog, The Loom, called Dark Matter of the Brain.
How old is it?
Oh, let's see, 2009.
Okay, I was thinking of something that goes even further back, but...
Yeah, I'll have to look at that later, and if it seems relevant, or in any case, we should link to it. Wow, so...
Yeah.
But you have to wonder that about so many sciences, like with this thing you were saying about cellular biology and how there was this, Francis Crick called it the standard dogma. And that basically information flows from the DNA into the DNA in the genome. Information goes from there to messenger RNA, and messenger RNA takes it to the ribosomes and uses the instructions to make proteins, which is basically what we are. And that's been the reigning, still is the paradigm of the field. And yet they find all these other. I mean, I remember learning about messenger RNA, right, in school. And I remember something about transfer RNA. These they're kind of like these Lego adapters that that match the proteins to the RNA transcription of what the DNA's instructions are. And then you had ribosomal RNA. And that was pretty much it. And then I'm sitting in all these sessions and I'm hearing there's microRNA, link RNA, siRNA for small interfering, SNO-RNA for small nuclear, and my favorite was piRNA, which stands for Pee-wee interacting, and Pee-wee stands for P-element induced wimpy testis. And I'm just thinking, my God, I was vaguely aware that there were all this kind of thing was going on. And I remember a good piece by Nicholas Wade in the Times a few years ago about this kind of thing. but I just had no idea how much more complex and elaborated it had all become.
George?
And again, it makes you wonder, was the original research that led to the standard dogma, could this be the drunk finding his keys under the lamppost, and yet when everything outside in the dark is still lurking there, might be at least as important or conceivably more important?
I think it could be the end of reductionism, George. Reductionism has done sort of what you want to happen in science is that you start with these incredibly messy details, and that the more you study, sort of the way that particle physics was in, the mid-50s or so, when you just had all these mesons and all this shit coming out of particle accelerators, and everybody was like totally stumped trying to make sense of it all. And then you had quark theory, and all of a sudden there was this simplicity underlying the complexity. And particle physics is still, maintained that fairly simple model. It's a little kludgier than they would like and so forth. But what you're having, obviously, in biology on all these different levels, cell biology, basic genetics, cancer biology, neurobiology, is a period in which the reductionism really seems to work. You get complexity yielding this beautiful, elegant simplicity, and then it's all starting to unravel.
And it gets all fuzzed up again.
Yeah.
And yet it works, and yet the basic picture obviously works, even to the sense, that they can essentially reach into a cell and put in, some DNA from another cell,
right,
and get it to do predictable things. So,
well, that's true, except that
that's a pretty powerful vindication.
It is
the basic idea.
Although what you would really want, I still think there's this fascinating gap. You see it in a lot of different fields in science. A classic example I like to mention is that basically we understood fusion by late 30s, certainly by the late 40s, early 50s, and fusion seemed to be this very simple physical process. And with that basic understanding, of course, we would eventually have fusion reactors, and it just turned out that there were all these complications that made that very hard. And what you want to really validate a theory in biology is some really powerful practical applications. You have that with quantum mechanics, but when it comes to genetics, there are a lot of things that we can do, but there's so many things that we want to do that we can't do yet.
Yeah.
And that's an indication of the remaining mystery in how our biology works.
Yeah. And they're constantly looking for these things, and in cancer, I mentioned that Weinberg was working on this, this thing with this incredibly convoluted name, the epidermal mesenchymal transition.
I'm so impressed that
you
can say that.
It took me a lot of practice. It's EMT, they call it. And the idea is they discovered much earlier on in developmental biology that when an embryo is developing inside the womb of any creature that they studied, that there are epidermal cells or epidural cells that these are what we usually think of as cells. They link up and form tissues. Like our skin and the linings of our organs. So the epidermal cells are kind of stationary, well behaved. They're all locked together into these structures called tissues and organs. But while an embryo is developing, it has to form these cells, but then it'll have to convert them into something called mesenchymal or mesenchymal cells. And they're like these wandering loose cells that can just go around, and then maybe they go to a different part of the developing fetus to form a kidney, and then they turn back into epidermal cells to start forming the kidney, and then a few of those convert to mesenchymal cells and set out to form another organ. So there's this idea that Weinberg's one of the most prominent opponents of, many people are proponents of, and many people are working on, that this happens with cancer, that the cancer cell, through random mutations, is able to switch on this EMT process. It's all there in its DNA library, but it's been turned off since since after the embryo became the creature, and it's turned on during cancer and used for metastasis. So cancer cells that are stuck together in an epidermal way, some of them can loosen up and go out and wander through the bloodstream to form not new organs as they do in the fetus, but new tumors.
Yeah.
And it's just mind-blowing, and it's become controversial because no one's basically done the experiment that shows you can turn this off and then the cancer won't metastasize. Somehow they need to do a laboratory dish experiment that would indicate something like that. Mm-hmm. Or maybe in vivo, I don't know, but God, all of this.
It is interesting.
Scary.
It's so funny. I can see how they get caught up in this as a pure intellectual enterprise, mm-hmm. because it really is. It is fascinating, and it raises some pretty profound philosophical questions about who the hell is really in control in our bodies, and what does it even mean to talk about ourselves as organisms when there actually are so many different kind of mini organisms doing their own thing in us. It's really fascinating stuff, George.
Well, it's mind-blowing. Yeah, and then every time I get way out, just becoming fascinated by, the depth of all this complexity and the intellectual problem, then I'm suddenly, roped back into remembering, this is some real terrible thing that happens to people, including people very close to me. So.
Well, when you were talking about how Weinberg views the problem of cancer, I was thinking, of course, of how I think it was Oppenheimer who described working on the Manhattan Project as, I think he used the term sweet, as a sweet problem. This kind of technical puzzle that all these great minds were working on. Of course, there the outcome was this weapon of mass destruction. At least the outcome of cancer is, the problem is a horrific one. But their work, I'm sure, will eventually take us out of the stone age of treatment that we're still in now and towards something much more effective. I hope.
Yeah, we hope.
George, we're at an hour and 7 minutes.
Ah, we did it again.
Yeah.
Okay, well, it's really great talking to you. Wow, that's one of the more stimulating conversations I've had recently.
Same here. And, once again, I think, there are all these complaints on Science Saturday that there's not enough science. And
I didn't know that.
when I check and when other people are talking or some of the comments, see what the competition does, often it's about science and religion or philosophy and all that sort of stuff. But what you're working on is, that is really, that's real science. Biology, genes.
Pretty nitty gritty.
RNA snippets and stuff. And that other thing that you said so articulately.
Oh, what was that?
The mesomelia
epidermal mesenchymal transition.
Yeah, that's it.
And then there's also a mesenchymal epidermal transition.
See, come on.
Where it goes the other way.
That
it's a real tongue twister.
Is science. All right, George.
Okay, we should leave it there, and let's do this again real soon.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, John.
Bye-bye.
Bye.